Hello my lovelies and welcome back to my channel. I'm Heather and this is the Happenings with H.A.P. H.A.P. meaning my initials. So it is the latter middle half of October and I have so far spent October not only reading a bunch of spooky books that I'm absolutely loving, October TBR is in the cards above, but I have also been filling my time watching scary movies and TV shows. Like most people, I go on a horror movie binge this time of year because it's my favorite time of year. And I figured that I would do a video on my favorite horror franchise of all time. Now, I titled this Unpopular Opinion because I know that this is an unpopular opinion, because usually when I tell people what my favorite horror franchise is, they look at me like I'm kind of strange. This does not negate the wonderful horror movies that exist in other franchises. One of my top favorite horror movies of all time is Halloween. However, the franchise ebbed and flowed and is still going on, and I've seen 90% of that franchise and is basically all over the place. So when I say horror franchise, I just mean that it's my favorite because of its consistent quality of films. Are they all perfect? Of course not. I'll go into it in the video. But it's still my favorite. I watch it every year, and that horror franchise is Paranormal Activity. Not really a spoiler because it was in the title, but we are going to get into why this is my favorite horror franchise of all time. As always, thank you so much for visiting my channel and watching my videos. Thank you to all of my subscribers. If you haven't already and would like to subscribe to be the first to see when I post a new video, hit the subscribe button down below. Give me a like, give me a comment, give me a dislike, put the notification bell on. There's lots of stuff you can do if you so choose. But thank you to everyone that has subscribed so far, and I hope you guys are enjoying the content. And with that, let us get into why Paranormal Activity is my favorite horror franchise of all time. An unpopular opinion. So Paranormal Activity, for those that don't know, was a 2007 film, written, directed, shot, edited by Oren Peli. It was actually his first film, and it was a super indie, low-budget film. The first one was only shot, I think, for like $15,000, which, yes, it's a lot of money, but for films, especially major Hollywood films, that is peanuts. It's nothing. And it really set off the new wave of found footage horror, much like the Blair Witch Project did in 1999. The original film follows a young couple that have been experiencing paranormal activity in their house, and they decide to set up a camera in their bedroom to film at night, because that is when a lot of this activity happens, and just to see if they can document what's going on. The film rode the festival circuit for a few years and had a limited US release on September 25th, 2009, and then had a nationwide release on October 16th, 2009. The series is also very significant because it actually is what was able to fund and start Blumhouse Productions, which, as we all know, is kind of now the leader of modern horror at the moment, with the Paranormal Activity series, the Insidious series, the Purge series, Happy Death Day series. It even produced Split and Get Out. It's kind of amazing seeing the amount of films that have come out of that production house, and it all literally started because of the return investment that Paranormal Activity brought. It's considered to be one of the most successful films ever made based on cost and return investment. So that's pretty incredible for a found footage film. Since that first film, the series blew up and has released a total of 6 installments, including the first film. Paranormal Activity 2 was released in 2010, Paranormal Activity 3 released in 2011, Paranormal Activity 4 in 2012, Paranormal Activity 5, or Paranormal Activity The Marked Ones, was released in 2014, and then what was supposed to be labeled the final installment, Paranormal Activity 6, or Paranormal Activity The Ghost Dimension, was released in 2015. But it has now been confirmed that Blumhouse is working on a 7th installment that was scheduled to be released in 2021, but has now been pushed back to March 4th, 2022 release date. No one knows exactly what that last one's going to be about, but I'm definitely going to see it. So what was my first experience with this film? I actually, having lived in New York, I was able to see the first limited screeners. It was a really smart viral marketing campaign that they did with the first one, where it had rode the horror festival circuit for a couple of years. And in order to see it in your market, they wanted you to go online and put where you were from and request it. Living in New York City, obviously we always get limited releases, so I was able to see it before the nationwide release. And I remember seeing it in a 42nd Street movie movie theater. I had been living in New York for probably a year at that point, and my friend from Pennsylvania visited, and we wanted to go see it for her birthday, just as like a fun thing to do while she was visiting the city. The theater was packed. There's nothing like a really great packed theater and the entire audience is along for the ride, and that was exactly what this movie was. You can go on YouTube and see the marketed audience reaction videos.
I'd have camera on.
I feel it breathing on me.
Footsteps out.
Not in control.
And yes, of course, they're exaggerated, but not entirely. This was like a theatrical experience, and I actually was scared. My level of horror, I very much get freaked out with more supernatural, paranormal type of horror, more so than the, serial killer, body horror type of stuff. I guess because in my brain, I could probably fight off a person, but I can't really fight off an entity that I can't see. That's why, like, The Exorcist is one of my favorite movies and still scares me a bit because of just the unknown factor of being completely helpless in a situation. That's probably why this series does freak me out so much in a good way. Like, I enjoy watching them, but they definitely do scare. One thing I loved about the film when I first saw it was the fact that it was doing something different. Yes, we have had found footage horror films since the Blair Witch Project, which really started the entire phenomenon with it. But in the first decade of the 2000s, especially the early part, torture porn was really starting to make a mark on the horror industry. So you had the Saw series, Hostel series, stuff like that. The first installment of Saw is a masterpiece because it was so unexpected and it was so different. But now that that's become kind of the norm with body horror, and it's just... it's more gross than anything, and there's only just so much you can do. It's just basically then upping the ante of like, oh, what depraved thing can we simulate on an actor or actress, usually an actress. I was already tired of that stuff. By the time 2009 rolled around especially, like, it just wasn't really good horror to me anymore. It had gotten old really fast, and I saw, I want to say, the first 4 or 5 installments of Saw in the theaters. I had seen Black Christmas, I had seen both Hostel films, like I had seen it all, so it's like I didn't really find it scary, just gross, and I wanted to be scared again. Like, that was something I missed in horror. The camera angles, the simplicity. I feel like with Paranormal Activity, that kind of horror started to become mainstream again. Because the budget was so low, it had to rely on filming techniques. It had to rely on practical effects, what minimal practical effects there were. It didn't have to rely on CGI. And yes, body horror does have practical effects with makeup, and I'm not taking anything away from makeup artists in the industry because they are wonderful and they do amazing work. But I was just tired of that type of horror and I wanted something different. And this was like a bright beacon. And as I had said, with the iteration of Blumhouse Productions, that type of horror, that type of, kind of mindfuck horror and paranormal horror started to become mainstream again. And it's so great because after this, you had The Conjuring, you had Insidious, you had Get Out, which was definitely a mind-bender horror. And it wouldn't have happened if this film had not existed, which is crazy. Now, as I said before, not every entry in this series is perfect. I basically like all of them. I love some more than others, except for the last installment. The last installment, The Ghost Dimension, was supposed to be an ending and supposed to answer all the questions of the rest of the series, but it definitely didn't do that. Having one film in a series of 6 that is subpar in comparison to all the Halloweens that there are, all the Friday the 13th, all the Nightmare on Elm Street. I've pretty much seen almost every film in those franchises, and some are just way out there. They don't continue the story at all. Some are just one-offs. Some are just crazy. Usually the first and second are usually pretty up there. Like the first 2 Halloweens complement each other. The first 2 Friday the 13th complement each other, and it just kind of creates a good, thorough storyline. Nightmare on Elm Street didn't really do that until around the 3rd movie, and then it tried to do that, but it still kind of staggered. Whereas this was like, okay, we set an establishing thing of it's not the house that's haunted, it's the person, and this is why. And each iteration keeps giving you more clues as to the backstory of why did this all happen in the first film. And I love that the timelines do jump around a bit. So Paranormal Activity 2 is actually a joint prequel and sequel to the first one, and focuses on Katie's sister Christy and her new baby and her family, whereas Paranormal Activity 3 is actually Katie and Christy when they were children and kind of shows the beginning of this hauntings that was happening. Paranormal Activity 4 takes place years after the first film and follows what seems to be separate family but is not as part of the franchise. And Paranormal Activity 5 is again another sequel that doesn't seem to have much relation to the first one, but it actually does, and especially the ending of the marked ones is really great. Ghost Dimension, I felt, subverted some of the things that they established in the other films, and I was left a little bit unsatisfied, but it's still an enjoyable one. However, Paranormal Activity Ghost Dimension uses the most CGI, I think, of any of the installments, and probably is why it's the more subpar one, because the simple effects and green screens and whatever pulleys and systems that they use in the earlier films is what made them so special and so creepy, because you're literally looking for what's going to happen in the frame. And I have to give it up for the actors, in particular Katie Featherston, who plays Katie in the first one and appears regularly throughout almost every single installment. One thing I loved about her, unfortunately or fortunately, however you want to look at it, was kind of a representation for the average American woman. And that's, I think, what sold the first film so much. For those that remember or don't remember, there was a whole body shaming incident when the film came out. People called her fat and stuff like that. Whereas I was watching it and I was like, oh, that is a very pretty average looking woman on the screen, which makes this seem more real instead of having a very attractive A-list Hollywood actress on screen trying to portray these things. And the fact that both Katie Featherston and Mika Slout, who played Mika in the first one, were completely, indie unknown actors is what made this series so good. And the fact that they continued casting actors and actresses who were very much unknowns continued to sell it. Never really had anyone that's been like a huge name in the industry be in these films, and I think that's what keeps the authenticity of them. You might see these actors obviously in other projects because they're still working, but it's not to the extent of like having Scarlett Johansson or Jennifer Lawrence or someone like that in there, which would totally, I feel like, take away the authenticity of these films. And I'm so glad that they continue to do that. It just makes it that much better for me. I'm hoping with the 7th installment of this series that we will get more of the lore that's been established. So Katie and Chrissy's grandmother was actually part of a coven later to be named as the Midwives. We believe that Katie and Christy's grandmother and their past family had dealings with this coven, and in order to get wealth and power, promised the firstborn son in the family line to a demon, and that's where the trouble of the first bunch of Paranormal Activity installments gets into. But it's also revealed that the sons of women that are part of this coven are also marked to be an army for the demon. The demon being called throughout the series Toby. He's named in Paranormal Activity 3 and actually it has a bigger role to play in the Ghost Dimension. We're not really sure the end goal of this coven. Is it world domination? Is it to give this demon power to be mortal a la The Omen? Not 100% sure, as the Ghost Dimension kind of makes this a little bit trickier, but that's the basic plot that runs throughout the entire series. And essentially Katie and Christy were just kind of pawns in something that their older relative had done to them without really them knowing about it, remembering it, or obviously consenting to it. Which is why in the first film, the psychic suggests that it's not necessarily the house that is haunted or having issues with, it's attached to Katie. So how do the films stack up in relation to each other, in relation to a series as a whole? I definitely have favorites and least favorites. Least favorite definitely being the Ghost Dimension, mostly because of what I felt was a bit of excessive CGI use, but also because I thought it made the plot of the other films be a little bit more muddled. And even though the writer of the other ones actually was the director of Ghost Dimension, I felt it had the least to kind of do with the other films in the the series and the running plot throughout the series, even though it was directed by actually one of the main writers of the series. So that's pretty interesting, but it's my least favorite for those reasons. It's not bad, and for a horror movie, it's fine. It just made things more confusing when it was supposed to answer questions, which is why I didn't really like it. Considering that's the only one that I consider really subpar out of a series of 6 films that's saying something. Obviously, the first one is landmark, and it definitely stands the test of time even 11 years later. I still can watch it and still be as creeped out. Paranormal Activity 3 had, I think, some of the best scares because of how the tracking shots were performed. In that one, Katie and Christy's mom's boyfriend is the one that sets up the cameras throughout the house and figures out a way to make a 1980s camcorder sit on a fan so it goes back and forth in a living room. Those shots of, you're watching something happen on the left side and you have to go all the way to the right and all the way to the back to see if it's moved, something's changed. And some of those scares were really well done, and the practical effects in it were really well done.
You okay?
Mommy, what happened? Stay upstairs. Stay upstairs. Don't come down here.
Also, that's where more of the lore started to develop a little bit. It was a great prequel because it's technically the second prequel in the series. Really kind of explained what was going on and how it all started. Surprisingly enough, the 5th installment, Paranormal Activities, the marked ones, was really wonderful as a mode of plot development. I remember seeing the ads for it and I was like, why are they making this that has nothing to do with Katie or the family that's been involved in the other 4 films before it? And I was severely wrong about that. One thing I loved about the marked ones was that it took it out of rich white suburbia with these people in these mansion homes and took it into Latinx California in an apartment complex. Like, it was a different type of dynamic because it involved more of a friendship dynamic.
3, go! Oh, fuck! Yo, you okay?
Shit.
You alright?
I'm not cool, man.
You want me to help you up?
Fuck, why did that fucker
Here.
catch me?
2, 3.
Oh, shit! What the fuck?
Gotta breathe in and breathe out.
What? That's insane, Jesse! Oh, shit! Oh my...
As well as a, very small family unit. And also it really deepened the lore. It was where we first get a name for the coven that Katie and Christy's grandmother was involved with. And we see what they're trying to actively do to these women and to these kids. And I loved how things start off really great and just slowly keep getting worse and worse. And the ending of it, the ending does lead us into Ghost Dimension, but I loved the way that they did the ending, which was a huge risk. I'm not going to spoil it, but the ending for it was definitely a surprise. And I was like, okay, it surprisingly tied a lot of strings. And I felt that the 5th one actually answered more questions than the 6th one did, which is kind of wild. And especially the fact that it really doesn't have anything exactly to do with Katie and Christy's family, but it's just something that's been going on in this part of California for a very long time. And I think that's really cool. And just the representation, because literally it is a Latinx-led film. It definitely has more CGI than the first 4 films, but it's used in a very good way that I was not upset with. Like, it told the story. It wasn't just for show and being fancy, and I really enjoyed that a lot. But the marked ones is surprisingly, it's in my top 3 of the series, which is kind of wild. Why is it scary? So I've already explained my reasons of why I love these films, but a big reason is just the forced perspective the viewer is supposed to have. And that's with most found footage, but this one really utilizes it well. Whereas with the Blair Witch Project, for instance, yes, it was found footage, but you were basically meant to be those characters' eyes, and so it was disjointed and confusing and stuff like that. Whereas in the Paranormal Activity series, you were meant to be the camera's eyes, and you were forced to watch things happen as they unfold, and to scan the frame and see if any weird thing happens, and then you get a shock by it. I love that, especially the first one is just filmed with these long static shots and silence. So it's one of the very few instances in a movie theater where it was packed and yet the audience was completely quiet, trying to hear if something was happening, trying to look at the screen and seeing if something was happening. This is a fun little fact for people that watch horror movies. If you ever don't want to see something on frame, try to look to the bottom left corner, because very rarely will anything ever really happen in the bottom left corner of a frame. But in Paranormal Activity, you are always granted that. That's not always true, because usually things happen in different parts of the frame, and that's what makes it scary, because you can't really escape it, because you're forced to sit through it and watch it. And yeah, the way they are shot, it's so simple, but it's so effective. The less amount of CGI used, the better, because that's what makes it all the creepier. And there's a really cool interview quote where Alfred Hitchcock discusses the difference between suspense and surprise. And essentially, surprise is, something happens, like a jump scare that scares everybody. But suspense is when the audience sees something happening and wants to warn the characters, and the characters is unaware and they can't. So that suspense lasts way longer than that surprise would be. And I think that's the beauty of this series, is that as the viewer, we see these things happening and we want to warn the characters, but we can't. So we are sitting in suspense of what will happen to them. It's just what makes it more scary. And it really encompasses that idea from Hitchcock about horror and suspense, and how it is so much better than seeing someone get cut up, seeing in his interview a bomb exploding. When you see it there and and you want to warn these characters and you want to have someone do something, but you can't. So you're just in suspense of what will happen. That's what I think that these films offer, is a lot of suspense. Are they the scariest films ever made? Of course not. They are definitely not. But they do creep me out. As I said, as someone that finds the paranormal kind of creepy, still gets a little freaked out if I'm alone in the dark, especially after watching something creepy. They definitely creep me out a lot. And having watched each of them multiple times over the years, I still get creeped out. And that's saying something. That's a staying power, because if you can't have a rewatch and still get creeped out and still enjoy it as much, then something's wrong. And I'm very ecstatic for what the 7th film will bring, and I'm hoping that they kind of go back to the roots of the simplicity, because regardless of even the ones that did have CGI, these are still some of the least expensive horror films made today, because of how much of a shoestring budget they want to give them to just do practical effects, which I think is really great. So I'm hoping that they keep up with that in this mysterious 7th installment. And you can bet that when it eventually releases, I will definitely do a video on it, or if we find out anything about it. But yeah, it's just a series that I can watch over and over, and I always watch the entire series every October, because it's just one of my jams. I love it, and I've yet to find a really great horror series that continuously had a level of good films in the entire series that didn't just completely jump the shark in one way or the other compared to this one. And if you haven't watched them, I definitely suggest that you do. I suggest to watch them in the release order, but if you want to watch them in chronological order, that would be start with Paranormal Activity 3, go to Paranormal Activity 2, Paranormal Activity 1, Paranormal Activity 4, Paranormal Activity the Marked Ones, and Paranormal Activity Ghost Dimension. That is the chronological order of all the films, but definitely watch them on the way that they're released, because the way things are revealed makes better sense than if you jumped around a bit with the first few. It's not as impactful, I don't think, in comparison. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed my little love fest for the Paranormal Activity series. As I said, I know this is an unpopular opinion. If you love this series, comment down below. If you hate this series, comment down below. I'd love to chat, because I know that this is not everyone's cup of tea, because everyone has different horror likes and dislikes, but it's my favorite horror franchise, but also some of my favorite horror films of the 21st century. So it is what it is. We all like what we like, but I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.